Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Brookings. My name is Tarun Chabra. I'm a visiting fellow here at Brookings and at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here for an event on America's Global Image, co-hosted by both Brookings and the Pew Research Center. This year marks the third year running that Brookings and Pew are co-hosting a public event to launch and discuss their important regular survey data about America's place in the world and other pressing global issues. As many of you are probably already aware, if you glanced at the newspaper or checked your social media accounts this morning, last night Pew released the latest edition of its Global Attitude Survey, which has been conducted since 2002. With this year's survey covering 37 countries and more than 40,000 respondents, all conducted after the inauguration of President Trump between February 16th and May 8th of this year. And the findings are newsworthy, particularly during a week in which the White House is hosting the Prime Minister of India, on Thursday hosting the President of the Republic of Korea, and a week ahead of President Trump's travel to Germany for this year's G20 summit. Which will feature 20 heads of state and government and numerous bilateral meetings, including a possible meeting between President Trump and Russian President Putin. So to share with us the highlights of this year's survey, we're privileged to have Richard Wieck, Director of Global Attitudes at the Pew Research Center. Richard has been the author of numerous recent Pew survey reports, and you've likely read his analyses in a variety of newspapers and seen his commentary on television, not just in the United States, but also abroad. Richard holds a doctorate in political science from Emory and previously worked at the research and strategy consulting firm Greenberg Quinlan Rosner. Following Richard's 20-minute presentation, I'll welcome to the stage a stellar panel of analysts from Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations, whom I'll introduce to you when we are all seated. And we'll have a 45-minute discussion of whether and if so, how these survey results matter. And then we'll turn to a 25-minute Q&A with all of you here today. I want to extend a special thanks before we get started to Sadie, Jonathan, Will Moreland for putting together this event today, along with their counterparts at Pew. And with that, Richard, please take it away.
All right, thank you, and thanks very much to Brookings for hosting this. Thanks to all the panelists for being here, and thanks to all of you for being here. Really happy to have a chance to talk about our most recent survey that we conducted at the Pew Research Center. And in particular, happy to have a chance to talk about this topic. We look at lots of different topics in our international survey work at Pew, but this is the one we've done the most work on consistently over the years. How does the world see the United States? We've been doing that now for a decade and a half. And as you can imagine, we've seen lots of changes over that decade and a half, and we certainly have a lot of changes this year. So what I'll do is I'll walk through a few slides that highlight some of the key findings from this report that we released last night. Before I do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We've been around over 2 decades now. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust. We also get funding from other foundations. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy. We like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank because we put such an emphasis on data and empirical research. You can see some of the topics here that we tend to look at in our research, and I'll put a plug in for the website while I'm here. All our reports are there, things like op-eds and blog posts. Increasingly, we have some cool interactive features, including one associated with this report that you can go in and play around with the data a little bit yourself. And if you are a number cruncher, you can go to our websites and download our data sets as well and use that in your own analysis. Briefly on the methodology for this survey, it was conducted in 37 countries around the world. I'll show you a map with those countries in just a moment, from February to May. In some countries, we do telephone interviews. In most countries, it's actually a face-to-face interview. And you can see the margin of error there, which is pretty typical for this kind of survey work. and I'll be happy to talk more about the methodology or answer questions about how we go about conducting this type of work around the world during Q&A if you're interested. So these are the 37 countries that were included in the survey. Each year there's always countries we'd like to include but weren't able to for one reason or another. But in general, I think we do a pretty good job of including countries from regions around the world. So what do we find? Well, let me start off by showing you some data on what I think are the two most fundamental measures in the survey. One is a question we've asked about a variety of world leaders for years. We asked about President Bush when he was president, President Obama, and then this year about President Trump. How much confidence do you have in President Trump to do the right thing in world affairs? And then the other question is a basic question we and others have asked. We call it U.S. favorability. Very simply, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the United States? And what we see in this year's survey is that if you look at the confidence measure, there's been a big shift in how the world sees the U.S. president. So if you look at these 37 countries and go back to the last couple of years of the Obama era, 64% said they had confidence in President Obama. Just 23% said they lacked confidence in him. This year, same question about President Trump. 74% say they do not have confidence in him to do the right thing in world affairs. Just 22% across these 37 countries say they do have confidence in him. So a big shift in terms of how the world sees the U.S. president. And what we also see in this data is that change in who's in the White House has had a big impact on how the world sees the United States. So this is that question about whether you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the U.S. Back again at the end of the Obama era, 64% favorable, 26% unfavorable. As you can see, that favorable line has gone down. The unfavorable line has gone up. So a big change in terms of how publics around the world see the U.S. president and a change in how they rate the United States as a country. Now, let's take a look at some specific countries in terms of this confidence measure. So in just about every country we surveyed, we see a significant gap in terms of ratings for Obama during the end of his presidency and ratings for Trump this year. And I can't fit all of them onto the slide, so this is just where we see a 50 percentage point gap or greater. So take Sweden, for example, at the top up here. 93% in our survey there last year said they had confidence in President Obama. Just 10% say this about President Trump. Big gaps in other European countries, but also in South Korea, Canada, Australia. Often the biggest gaps are in some of America's closest allies. Now, there are two countries where we see President Trump getting higher ratings than President Obama, Israel and Russia. So slightly higher ratings for President Trump in Israel, significantly higher ratings for President Trump in Russia. Obama's ratings had gone down a good bit after the Ukraine crisis and didn't bounce back this year. Much higher ratings among Russians for President Trump. Now, let's take the timeline back a little bit to the Bush years. Same question. This is data for 4 Western European countries that we've surveyed just about every year for the past decade and a half. And as you can see, President Bush starts off his term not especially popular in Western Europe. Those numbers come down over time. He's unpopular. There's a lot of opposition to key elements of his foreign policy. By the time he leaves office in 2008, his ratings are pretty low. President Obama comes into office in 2009. He gets, astronomical ratings in some countries. It's more than 90% positive, for example, in 2009 in Germany and France. Comes down a little bit over time. The NSA Snowden scandal, for example, had an impact on views towards President Obama in Germany and some other countries. But his ratings bounced back a little bit at the end of his term. He leaves office pretty popular. And then you can see what happens this year, a very steep slope downward. And Trump's ratings this year in these 4 Western European countries look a lot like what we saw in 2008 for President Bush when he left office. Same measure, this time comparing President Trump with other world leaders. And these are all median percentages across the 37 countries that we surveyed. So we asked about Angela Merkel, and she's the only one of the 4 leaders we tested who gets on balance positive ratings. 42% saying they have confidence in her, just 31% saying they don't have confidence in her. She and Putin both get negative ratings for the most part, but not as negative as what we see for President Trump. So, she and Putin, it's not positive, but the negative ratings aren't as high as what we see globally, at least, for President Trump. Now, here's the question on U.S. favorability on a country-by-country basis. And as you can see, often we see variations among regions across the world. We also see variations within regions quite often. So you can see that in Europe, places like Poland, Hungary, Italy, UK, mostly positive for the U.S., elsewhere mostly negative right now, including Germany, for example, 62% saying they have an unfavorable view of the U.S. If you look at Asia, again, you get a lot of variation across countries, very high ratings in Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea. Australians, you look down at the bottom of the screen, if you can see it, essentially divided right now in terms of views of the U.S. Of course, Australia, a longtime ally of the United States. In the Middle East, consistently high ratings for the U.S. in virtually all of our surveys in Israel, even if views towards the U.S. president have fluctuated a bit over time. Negative ratings, mostly in the Middle East, something we've seen pretty consistently over time. Of course, President Obama came into office hoping to turn around America's image in the region, gave a famous speech in Cairo in June 2009, sort of to kick off those efforts. We didn't see a real sea change during the Obama presidency in terms of views of the U.S., and it's certainly very negative in this year's survey, especially in Turkey and Jordan. Africa is a region where we've typically seen mostly positive views towards the United States. That was true during the Bush era when there was a rise in anti-Americanism in many regions. He was pretty popular there. His policies were relatively popular there, and the U.S. continued to get good ratings there. Same was true, or maybe even more so, during the Obama era. And even though there have been some declines in Africa in this survey, on balance, the countries we surveyed at least continue to see the U.S. in a positive light. Latin America, again, some differences across the Latin American nations that we surveyed. Mexico stands out as a place in this year's survey that has very negative ratings for the U.S., at least vis-a-vis what people used to say in our Mexico surveys. And you can see that a little bit on this map here. So this is a map that illustrates the change in U.S. favorability since the last time we surveyed in all of these countries. So red countries are where there's been a negative change. Dark gray is where there's been essentially no change. And then blue are places where America's image has improved on this favorability measure. So there are only 2 blue countries on the map. One is Vietnam. I wouldn't make too much of that. I believe the change in Vietnam was from 78% favorable to 84%. So, went from already very high to slightly higher. And of course, the big changes in Russia. I believe the numbers there, last time we surveyed in 2015 was 15% favorable, and then 41% this year. So, again, in different places in this survey, Russia is an outlier. Lots of dark red in Europe, lots of dark red in Latin America. The darkest red in Mexico, that's the country where we see the biggest decline in U.S. favorability. It's gone from 66% favorable in 2015 to 30% this year. So we want to understand better how the world sees President Trump. So we asked about some of his policies and some of his character traits. So when it comes to policy, we tested 5. His proposal to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal, restricting people from certain majority Muslim countries from entering the United States, withdrawing from climate and trade agreements, and building the wall on the border with Mexico. So these, again, are global medians across all the countries we surveyed. And as you can see, these policies are all broadly unpopular across the countries that we surveyed. The Iranian nuclear deal, a little less so, but even there, on balance, global publics tell us they disapprove of this proposal. Now, there are pockets of support for some of these. I believe the pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, for example, is popular in Israel and Jordan. You know, there are certain places where some of these policies are embraced, but on the whole, we see pretty widespread global opposition to the policy proposals that we tested on the survey. Now, we also asked about certain characteristics, both positive and negative, and whether people associate those with President Trump. So we read them this list, some positive, some negative. And as you can see, the negative characteristics, people tended to say, yes, I would describe Donald Trump in that way. So in particular, arrogant. Majorities around the world also say they think of Trump as intolerant and even dangerous. Relatively low numbers say he cares about ordinary people, or that he's well qualified to be president. About 4 in 10 say they think of him as charismatic. The kind of bright spot in terms of views about Trump around the world is this question of being a strong leader. You do see majorities around the world saying, yes, they associate the term strong leader with him. And that includes some places where other ratings for Trump are pretty negative. Take France, for example. I think 54% there say that they think of Trump as a strong leader, while just 14% say they have confidence in Trump to do the right thing in world affairs. So, that's a characteristic that stands out as being positive, even in some places where overall attitudes towards Trump are very negative. Something we've done in the past in our surveys and did again this year is look at attitudes towards different aspects of, what we might think of as American soft power. So again, global medians on some questions that we think sort of tap into the notion of soft power. The American people continue to score pretty well on our surveys. 58% across the countries we surveyed say they think of the American people in a positive light. People tend to say they like American popular culture. 65% say, I like American movies and music and television. The U.S. gets pretty good ratings in terms of respecting the individual liberty of its citizens. That's a question we've seen some downward trends on over the last few years in the wake of the NSA story, but on balance, people still tend to think that the U.S. government does respect personal freedoms. More mixed views when it comes to American ideas about democracy. And then you see the negative ratings on this question we ask about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that American customs and ideas are spreading to our country. And this overall pattern is pretty typical of what we've seen on these questions. The numbers have come down a bit in some countries, but this overall pattern has pretty consistently been true. If you look, for example, at the American customs and ideas question and the popular culture question, it's sort of an interesting contrast, right? People, they want their, Jay-Z and their Taylor Swift and their superhero movies, but they're also worried about American culture kind of pushing out their own local cultures and traditions, and it's representative of this kind of push and pull that people feel about the United States in lots of ways. And then a final topic we wanted to look at was what people think about the near future of relations with the U.S. We asked people, now that Trump is president, do you think that relations between your country and the U.S. are going to get better, get worse, or stay about the same? So outside of Africa, you don't see a lot of people saying things are going to get better. You see pretty significant numbers in many countries saying things are going to get worse. But as you can see from this slide, across regions, really the prevailing view in many places is that things are going to stay about the same, which I think is an interesting finding given all the negativity we see towards President Trump and towards his policies, that nonetheless people don't necessarily think there's going to be some sort of radical sea change in terms of their country's relationship with the United States. And, I think that findings illustrates a broader point that we see in these findings, and that is that, even with this pretty negative picture of how the world currently sees the U.S., there are some bright spots. And I think this is something that we've seen over the last decade and a half in our research, that even if there's a pretty unpopular American president, if U.S. foreign policies are pretty unpopular, there's still some strong suits in America's global image and some things that people value about the United States, even if it's a time of great tensions with the American administration. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thanks.